Welcome to the Father on Purpose podcast, featuring author and ministry leader Kent Evans and business executive and military veteran Lawson Brown. This is a show for you, Dad. You want to be a godly and intentional father. Unfortunately, you've turned to these two knuckleheads for help. Let us know how that works out for you. Before we begin, remember this: you are not a father on accident. So go be a father on purpose. Please welcome your hosts, Kent and Lawson.
Lawson, what is up, my friend?
Hello, Kent. Have you been having a good week?
Yeah, I've had a good week, man. It's been like fast moving, like a lot going on. Had a friend in from out of town. Let me share what we're going to talk about on today's episode, and then I'll tell you about my week. Today, Dad, if you're tuning in, we're at the tail end of a series on the book of Nehemiah. My friend Eric Ballard and I wrote a book called Bring Your Hammer, and its subtitle is 28 Tools Dads Can Grab from the Book of Nehemiah. So 28 really short chapters, easy to read, quick reads, tips from how we can be more godly, effective fathers, straight out of the Old Testament book of Nehemiah. We're going to cover the last of that series today. If you've missed the first 9, go backward. You'll see them all there in the queue. Listen to the first 8 or 9 if you want to learn more about how Nehemiah can help you be a godly dad. Go back and check out those other episodes. And then if you'd be so kind, go snag a copy for you and your 47 best friends on Amazon. And then once you do that, you and all your 47 friends can write us a glowing review on Amazon. If you notice,
you said it's doing pretty good, right? You said it's
yeah, as books go, if you sell, I had Dennis Rainey, the famous guy at Family Life back in the day. Dennis told me one time, 95% of Christian books never sell 5,000 copies, 95%. And so if you hit over that several thousand copy mark, you're on your way. And the month of March was almost 2,000 copies for us. So that's good. It's a good start. So the reason I bring that up about the review is because Lawson here is my faithful and trusty co-host on the podcast. And the only thing that he could find positive to say about our book on Amazon was that it came in great packaging. So if you go to Amazon and you see the reviews.
So you saw that, huh?
I did. Okay. Yeah. Look for one from a chump named Lawson, who said, "Oh yeah, packaging was awesome." Actually, we were laughing about that. And I said, I dare you to put that up on Amazon. And he actually did it. Lawson, I'm impressed. He took the dare.
Well, I mean, the audience for this podcast and for just generally manhood journey, stuff it's a bunch of guys. They should have a good sense of humor. I hope people saw that and were like, "Oh, that's good. That's funny."
Right. Yeah. We're not, my wife would look at that and be like, she would actually roll her eyes and she would say, "Oh, Lawson, he is so dumb." She'd probably say something like that. But I really appreciated that review. But if you're dialing in now, today we're going to talk about godly dad finds his way to rebuking those who wander. Now, Lawson, you have a background as a business executive. You've run big teams, distributed teams who've had goals and objectives and targets to hit and number of customer visits to make, and you name it. You've been in the metrics and business world a long time. And before that, you were in the military. You were a Marine. So grateful for your service, by the way. I like to say that publicly any chance I get. Thank you for serving. And so over the course of your, 20 plus 30-year career, both militarily and business-wise, my hunch is you've had to be in a number of spots where you had to tell somebody they're not doing it right, or they're not doing enough, or they missed the mark somehow. Have you ever had to share that with someone in either a military or a business context?
Oh, yeah. I really like, first of all, how this chapter lays out. I was thinking of things as I got going into it and, kind of write notes to myself and then see later on in the chapter that, in fact, Eric is, Eric's the one that wrote this chapter that he would.
You seem to always have to bring that up. Like any chapter you like in this book, you seem to always have to point out, oh, that was a chapter written by Eric, not Kent.
There's a reason for that if you go back and look at the ones that we chose.
Okay, moving on.
So an early thought was that we just don't use the word rebuke, in like our modern day terms. It feels like to me an old Bible kind of term. So rebuke. And I was like, I'm pretty sure I know what that means. So I went back and looked.
Google it. May have to Google
I
that one.
certainly did. Looked up. Here's the definition: express sharp disapproval or criticism of someone because of their behavior or actions. That's the verb. And then the noun is an expression of sharp disapproval or criticism. And so it's not just like, hey, watch out for the way you just did that, or it's sharp, and it is disapproval. It is criticism. And I don't want to take lightly that is the word that rebuke is the word used in the Bible. I don't want to dilute that, dumb it down. And so, there were times in the Marine Corps where a rebuke needs to happen on the spot with force, with a louder voice, because someone's about to get hurt, or, someone's about to do something that's going to, really, really go wrong. And then in business, that's a whole lot more rare that, you need to sharply address something that someone is doing, their behavior, their action, as a sharp disapproval or criticism. But what I was saying is, one of the initial things I thought of getting into this chapter was the whole reprimand in private and reward in public. I think about that often because from a fatherhood standpoint, because it's just, if you can ever help it, it's just unnecessary to embarrass someone in front of other people, and so you've got a gaggle of kids. There's always a group, and I'm sure that's just not always hard to be like, in the moment, take a time out, move them out of the crowd and have a one-on-one discussion. That's always best, I think, versus just addressing it on the spot in front of everybody. And like in the Marine Corps, we had to do that sometimes. We'll get into it a little bit later, but from a drill instructor standpoint, I think that is something that they use as a tool, is correcting individual, whether it be bad behavior or somebody, mess something up. They're totally fine with doing that in front of everybody. In fact, I'm sure that's part of the prescription, is to embarrass. And then not only that, but if somebody does something wrong, guess what? Everybody gets to get punished because of that one person, So just a little bit of rambling thoughts as we get going. But I'm curious, how do you react to that about reprimand in private? In this case, rebuke in private and reward openly.
Yeah, I learned that basically the hard way as a dad. There were times when I would lean on my kids when they're 5 or 6 years old. It doesn't quite matter, because they don't quite have the social care about their friend circle. But when they get 10 or 11 or 12 and you start rebuking them in front of their friends, wow, man, you create a big issue. Because now what do you have? Now you have two separate issues, right? You got whatever he was doing that was not wise. And then now you have the emotional damage and the lack of trust and the fear connected with how my dad talks to me in front of my friends. I learned that the hard way eventually, where, I did it a few times and I thought, wow, that probably didn't work. I mean, my kids actually laugh these days about, I have this unnatural, and I really am working on it, like slowly. I'm 52. You'd think I'd be over it by now, but I have a major problem with people who chew with their mouth open, like at a dinner table. Something inside me, I don't know what it is. It's not even like, it's not natural. It's not healthy. But like, if you chew with your mouth open at my table, I can feel my blood pressure go up.
Like all you can do to not say something.
It's all I can do not to say something. And what I used to do, and if any of my older son, Alex or Jeremy, if any of their friends are listening to this show ever, they're going to go, oh yeah, I remember that. I would tell their friends, hey, could you chew with your mouth closed? Like my kids' friends. And they were like, it became this almost kind of running joke about what Mr. Evans might do to you if you chew with your mouth open. But I've gotten better about it, where now I don't rebuke at all anyone who's not in my own family, because it's just not kind. It's not friendly. It's like, I need to get over it. And what I've found over the years is, for example, we may be at like a party or at my house, and one of my kids does something that I think needs to be addressed fairly quickly. What I will do is I'll do the old, hey, Jonathan, I need your help with something. Right. And I'll walk down the hall and they'll follow me away from the party. And then I'll be like, hey, knock it off. Like, y'all need to cut it out. Don't do that anymore. And then we'll leave the room and he can make up whatever cover story he wants when he goes back to his friends. But I'm not going to rebuke him in front of his friends, but I might pull him aside and say, hey man, that this conversation y'all are having needs to be nipped in the bud.
Yeah. And I think there's you can see, I'm thinking about a baseball field where there are multiple dads and it just kills everybody, when that one dad is just railing on his son,
word.
Or at the soccer field, just yelling
word.
at his daughter. And it's awful. Like, it's just so cringy. And there's a reason for that, because it's our human nature that, to be pulled aside and corrected that's learning. That is, that you respond to that so differently than if somebody in front of your friends and other parents, you're getting called out, unreasonably, whether it's reason, with good reason or not. But the point is, dads, just do not do that to your kids. Their head will go right back into the turtle shell and they won't listen to the rest of what you've got to say. And it may be very valuable. So be wise and be careful with that.
It can persist, man. I mean, if you've ever been embarrassed about anything, whether, it's about rebuking or not, if you've ever been embarrassed, you can remember it. Like if some dad is listening to this show and he's in, Topeka, Kansas or Dallas, Texas or wherever, I think of a time when you were embarrassed. You're really embarrassed in front of people, your friends, your company, your wife, your kids, your church, whoever. Think of a time when you were embarrassed. And I'll bet you every dad listening can think of a time or two. And some of those times or two are 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And you still haven't forgotten it, because embarrassment, especially embarrassment like in a public setting or a surprise embarrassment, is really hard to forget.
Dude, I was in a meeting with probably 12 or 15 other people. I'm at the table. My boss is leading the meeting. This is a long, long time ago. This was back in the BlackBerry days. So this is before iPhones. And I'm on my BlackBerry in the meeting, and my boss, she stops the meeting and says, Lawson, I need you to, this is exactly what I was talking to you about in your review, where you're multitasking.
Oh, wow.
Is distracting, especially to me when I'm trying to lead a meeting. And dude, the room just got deathly quiet. And here it is. I'm not kidding, man. I bet it was over 20 years ago. And I remember it to this day, because it's just, there's something about being called out in front of other people. It did not make me want to respond, to listen to her encouragement and guidance from that point on, And so as dads, you got to just be so careful to correct in the right way.
It's funny because now you remind me, I walked into a meeting one time. I was an assistant hall director at the University of Kentucky, and we had a meeting of the assistant hall directors, and I walk in and I'm like 2 or 3 minutes late. And the leader, Jim Plaskanka, goes, "Hey, Kent, thanks for joining us. How late are you?" And I looked at my watch and I go, 3 minutes. And he goes, "Just a moment." And then he starts counting the people in the room. He goes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You're 24 minutes late. Have a seat. And man, okay. So
wow.
At one level, right? At one level, I'm like, what a jerk. I mean, did he have to do that? At the other level, I was like, that's a pretty good lesson. I just burned 24 minutes of productivity and I never forgot that lesson. Hunter can attest, right? If Hunter's 5 minutes late, man, right, I'm on him. And it's probably still, I'm lashing out from when I was 21 and being an assistant hall director at Kentucky. But when we're in that moment where we're the recipient, it just does a lot of damage if it's public and hateful. Yet we see Nehemiah rebuked those who got off track. Jesus rebuked a lot of people, not just the Pharisees, right? He rebuked some of his own disciples. He rebuked Peter.
And we as sons of God, as followers, we should kind of, I almost said crave, and maybe that is the right word. We should crave correction. We should crave discipline. That what's in the book, Proverbs 3:11 and 12 says, "My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline and do not resent his rebuke, because the Lord disciplines those he loves. As a father, the son he delights in." So there's an underlying reason for rebuke, for this disapproval or criticism of someone's behavior. But if if it doesn't stem from, if it's not coming from a source of, I love you and I want you to learn from this so that, you are better, you are going to avoid pain, whatever. Love should be the driving force behind each of our rebukes.
I'd like to tell a story of a guy who did this so perfectly. When I was in my 30s, I was a marketing consultant and I was not a very accountable one. I would make promises and break them all the time. And I'd gotten into this habit of overcommitting and under-delivering big time, right? So I had a client who I went to church with. Now I go to a big church, fortunately, so I can usually hide in the bushes, so to speak. And I didn't think I'd bump into this guy, but one day, man, after church, I see this guy. And I mean, I literally wanted to hide behind like a pillar or a chair. He owned a roofing company. He's a contractor. And you think of contractors being these rough, gruff guys, beat you up and throw you out. But he was a really quiet, soft-spoken, but commanding kind of leader, right? I think of almost like the NFL equivalent of Tony Dungy. He has this reputation of never really raising his voice, never flipping out on the sidelines, but you listened to him very carefully. And so this guy, Rick Steinrock, he sees me and he goes, "Hey, Kent, do you have a moment?" I just thought, it's not going to go well. And we go back into church and we sit down in this big auditorium. There's two of us in this big auditorium. We sit down and he goes, "I get the sense you're avoiding me. I've tried to contact you a few times and you haven't called me back. You haven't responded to my emails." Ooh. That's it. That's how he started.
Good for him. And then then he just stopped talking.
He just waited. He waited.
Let the silence do its work.
And I said, "Well, that's true. Yes, I've been avoiding you." And he goes, "Okay. My suspicion is it's because the project you owe me, you're not done with, even though we're kind of past the deadline. Is that true?" And again, quiet, calm. And I said, yeah, I'm not done." He goes, "Well, as a business guy, you owe me that work. We're paying you. I expect it done really soon." He goes, "But let me add, as a brother in Christ, I really expect better from another brother in Christ." And then he paused for a second. He goes, "But you know what? I'm sure you'll figure it out. Have a great day." Brother Lawson, I'm not kidding. We weren't in those chairs 2 minutes. Not 2 minutes by the clock.
That's a great example right there.
At least 20 years ago, maybe more, early 30s. And I've never forgotten it because, man, you talk about like somebody should put that in the rebuke hall of fame. Like if there were a hall of fame for rebukes, number one, it was really short. It was quick to the point. Number two, he didn't lead with his anger. He led with the facts, and he led with the establishment of the facts both ways, right? "Hey, I get the sense you're avoiding me. Is that true? All right. I think it's because you haven't finished the project. Is that accurate? Like, let me just make sure." For all he knows, I got hit by a car and was in a 4-week coma, right? And if I had been, then he'd have been like, "Gosh, brother, I'm so sorry. I'll pray for you," right? He had options. So then he confirms and just goes, "Okay. Well, in light of that, as a business guy, you owe me better. As a brother, you owe me better, but I'm sure you'll figure it out." Oh, my word. Brother, it was so good.
How effective was that?
Oh, man. I mean, it's literally, it should go in the rebuke hall of fame. Hey, Dad, do you wrestle with anger? Man, I sure have. And so have thousands of other dads in our email list. And so what we did for those dads and for you, we built a special digital course called The Anger-Free Dad. This digital course is chock full of almost 50 assets, a bunch of teaching videos, a ton of PDF booklets and worksheets, so you can walk through and understand your anger triggers, the expectations underneath, and how to pull those out of your heart and mind so you can be a dad who is less angry and more at peace. If you take this course and you do not become less angry, you will get all of your money back. Plus, we'll send you some boxing gloves so you can beat up the wall at your house with all of your mad anger. Dad, come take the Anger-Free Dad course today at manhoodjourney.org/anger-free-dad. That's manhoodjourney.org/anger-free-dad.
In chapter 27, a couple things came to mind about midway through, and I'll just paraphrase that I think the correction has to be done with the right measure. And I think timing is important. So when I say measure, what is written is, and I did this before. I've slapped one of my daughter's little hands when she's about to touch something that's
right.
going to hurt, and it scared him. She kind of scared him a little bit and made him start crying. But that was a whole lot better than had they touched what I did not want them to touch, like an iron.
Yeah, or them pulling back their hand and only having 2 fingers left.
Right. But what Eric writes is, you don't slap their hand as hard as you can. You measure
right.
the correction. And that's kind of a silly analogy to use when I'm talking about measuring your degree of rebuke. So that's one thing, measure it. And the second is timing. It doesn't have to happen in all cases in those moments. In fact, sometimes it's better. Like I remember, especially my youngest, Olivia, because she was just so expressive as a little girl. The spankings were never worse than the weight.
Yeah. We'll talk about this tonight. That
and hanging in her room was twofold. That weight was psychological, and she's up there just dreading, thinking about what happened. And then by the time I would make my way upstairs and go into her room, as soon as I opened the door, that was the spanking was nothing compared to that. And by the way, I think in those cases, especially you guys that have little kids, the weight is mandatory. If spanking is part of the agenda, just period, do not do it in the moment. The weight is good for them and it's good for you. So I just want to talk about the measure, the degree to which the rebuke, as well as the timing.
Well, and let's look at Nehemiah. So in Nehemiah, the other thing I would add to that, Lawson, is what it is that we're rebuking them about. So for example, sometimes we rebuke them for things that are preferences or that are just the way we want it, right? Chewing with your mouth open. I don't think that's listed among the 7 deadly sins, right? And so there's a reason, right? Because it's not a big deal. It's not a big deal. But what Nehemiah was rebuking the people of the city about was the work of God, right? So for example, Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 10, it says he found out that the portions of the Levites hadn't been given. So funds are not being allocated correctly. Resources are not being allocated correctly. And this is according to the commands God put in place. It's not just like some law was passed, just that they voted on. God said, hey, we're going to set aside the priests, and the priests get a certain allotment. And so then Nehemiah goes to the officials in verse 11 and says, I confronted the officials and said, why is the house of God forsaken? So just notice what he's choosing to rebuke them about is something that is spiritual and God ordained and holy and important to the administration of God's will on earth. It's not that, how come y'all got like the red carpet instead of the blue carpet? Like the stuff that we flip out over. How come y'all do so many hymns in this church? How come y'all do so many choruses in this church? It's not over matters of preference. It's over matters that are deep and rich and important. Even later, he goes on, one of my favorite verses in Nehemiah is chapter 13, verse 25. It says, and I confronted them and cursed them and beat some of them and pulled out their hair. In verse 25, and I made them take an oath in the name of God, saying, you shall not give your daughters to their sons or take your daughters for your sons for yourself. It was this idea of intermarrying the communities, which God had strictly forbidden. And he said, look, don't intermarry with these people. They will pull you away from the Lord your God. So I just want our dads to hear, sometimes we get really bent out of shape, like Kent Evans gets really bent out of shape over matters of preference, not like actual sin and not things that matter for any more than 5 minutes. But when we're going to tread into this area of rebuking or leaning on somebody, man, it's got to be significant. It's got to really matter.
Yeah. And what I think you do you're a great communicator. What you do in some of the stories you've told about the way you interact with your children is you pull out of them through questions to get them to a solution.
When I'm on my game, I don't always do that, but when I'm on my game, boy, you're right.
Yeah. I mean, you've got to. And the other thing in Nehemiah 13:11 goes on to say was basically he rebuked them and then got them back in position where they should have been and where they were meant to be, where they were going to be able to do God's work. He didn't just rebuke them and then steam off, like take that opportunity to measure your response correctly, to make sure your timing is right. Maybe there's good and a bad time. And maybe there's 2 or 3 things that gather together that you want to address at once because there's a trend or there's a tie, to them all. And there's some habit that's beginning. Like, be thoughtful about it, be wise in your approach, and help your kids understand where what they were doing or what they said or whatever the thing is can affect them long-term, or maybe could affect someone else longer term if it were to have continued, where someone could have gotten hurt. And then redirect. I guess I would just add rebuke and then redirect in a way that gets them back on track, like Nehemiah did. He stopped them.
Like you said, in verse 11, he confronts them, and then he says, and then I gathered them together and set them in their stations. So then I said, all right, look, guys, this is how it's supposed to happen. And then verse 12, he says, then all Judah brought the tithe of the grain, wine, and oil into the storehouses. So, okay, we're back on track, right? Now, that's what should have been happening. I've set them in their stations. They're bringing it in. And then he goes on in verse 13, it says, and I appointed as treasurers over the storehouses. And he goes on to talk about that, reliable people. So to your point, he said, hey, this is going wrong. Let me show you how to do it right. Let's get back on track. Okay. Anybody ready for lunch? That's to your point. He didn't just leave them hanging and make them just kind of figure it out on their own. It's so important for us as dads to keep in mind another verse of scripture. I want to fast forward mentally to Galatians 6:1, Lawson, where we're looking at how Nehemiah rebuked, and that's really important, and we've got to not lose sight of that. I also want to dive in to this verse in Galatians 6:1 because I find it very helpful in the area.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought this in.
Yeah, chapter 6, verse 1 in the book of Galatians says, brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, and let me pause for a second. Well, I'll come back. Let me come back to the word transgression. But if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. And to that end, it goes on to say, bear one another's burdens and fulfill the law of Christ. So it's the idea that it's redemptive and restorative. This word transgression in chapter 6, verse 1, doesn't mean, let me reread it. Brothers, if anyone is caught doing something you just don't like very much, or anyone's caught being a fan of a team you don't enjoy, if anyone's caught in a transgression, like an egregious sin, a sin, not just a matter of preference, and kind of doubling down on that topic, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. I've probably had 1,000 moments as a dad over the course of 22 years of fatherhood. What's that work out to math-wise? 10, 20, 40 something a year. That's one a week. Yeah, I've probably had 1,000 moments, ballpark, right? Get some quick math in my head. I've probably had 1,000 moments where I've had to rebuke my children. I mean, something as simple as don't go on the street or put that down or you're going to poke your eye out. Things that happen, just life. I'll bet you out of those 1,000, I've restored them in a spirit of gentleness. Well, let's go down. 500 of them, maybe only 300 of them were actual sins. Of the few hundred that were actual sins, I'll bet you I restored them in a spirit of gentleness 25% of the time. The other 75% of the time, I restored them in a spirit of harshness. I restored them I didn't even really restore them, right? I yelled at them. And to your point, sometimes those are safety issues. However, notice what it says. Restore them in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. We're going to end up with 2 sins if we're not careful. The sin of the child, and then the sin of the jerk, angry father. And by the way, Dad, those are not connected. I don't yell at my kid because of what he does. I yell at my kid because I choose to, because I'm sinful. And this verse is reminding us, Lawson, we got to keep an eye on ourselves, man. If we're going to restore someone, that's holy ground. We got to be careful there as we restore them, that we do it in a spirit of gentleness. I get the sense that even though you have this military and business background, you've always come across to me as someone who's wired a bit more patient. a bit more patient. You seem to have a more calm demeanor about yourself. Is this idea of restoring someone in a spirit of gentleness, is it an area of temptation for you, or do you find it comes a bit more naturally?
I've got to watch I guess I got to watch my mood, like I think the timing is a big deal. I got to do my best to bite my tongue often. I have learned through experience that, where I've done it wrong and address something in the moment, and not even necessarily about embarrassing somebody in front of others or anything like that we've already talked about. But if you do it too quickly, you don't have time to really think through your motive and how you're going to design for the outcome. And I've learned over time that, that it just does take time. And I continue to mess that up still to this day. I think the military in general has somewhat of a rap of, just a bunch of people running around screaming at each other.
You mean that's not what happens?
In fact, can we talk about who we have as a coming up guest on one of the episodes coming up?
Absolutely. Sneak preview.
Yeah. So in our conversation with the great Dr. Ken Blanchard.
Hey, I don't know if you heard that. If you're 45 or over and you've never heard the name Ken Blanchard, I mean, seriously, where have you been living? Where have you been living?
I think it's younger than that. I think it's 30 or over. My whole company is part of the foundation of our leadership is a Ken Blanchard situational leadership too.
What a guy, man.
Series. Yeah.
We just interviewed him like 2 days ago and it was a blast.
It was super great. Yeah. I couldn't believe it.
What were you going to say about Ken?
Well, but in that he talked about his father, who was a Navy officer. And in part of the conversation, we talked about how the military, somebody who may have only seen the military through movies thinks that everybody's running around yelling. It's kind of not that. There's a lot of time spent on effective leading of other people. And it rarely includes raising your voice and demeaning people in front of others. And so that was just beat into us early on for me as a young non-commissioned officer, and then later as an officer. But still the temptation is more, I think more so my temptation is getting all bent out of shape on something that just doesn't matter. It's just like you said, you're calling it a preference. It's just like some pet peeve or some little thing that irks me can get under my skin, and I just don't say anything. And before I know it, I've said the wrong thing. And it's something that's so inconsequential.
I shared one of mine. You got to share one of yours. So mine's chewing with your mouth open. I got 4 or 5 others if we need to keep going, but
mine's cleaning up behind yourself.
Really? Okay.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So what happens? You walk into like a bathroom, there's a piece of toilet paper sitting on the floor that someone obviously didn't pick up, and it's just right there. What do you do?
Oh yeah. I'll just wreck the whole rest of the room. I'll just tear it apart.
Oh, I'll turn into the Hulk.
No, I don't.
He's so great, man. I walk into some restaurant and just hear this like commotion in the bathroom. Like, what's going on? Oh, Lawson probably found some tissues out of place or something.
I don't know. Why is Dad doing that now?
It's so true though, man. We have these things that really in the grand scheme can be pretty minor, but boy, we get bent out of shape over them. Big time. So a couple things, Lawson, I want to make sure we don't forget. We're getting toward the end of this episode. Couple quick kind of wrap ups, but then I want to kick it back to you for some comments. Number one, you did mention something about Ken Blanchard. He'll be on in a few weeks after you hear this episode, a few weeks from the time this episode airs later. Dr. Ken Blanchard was with us, and he talked about fatherhood and grandfatherhood and leadership and writing and business. And oh my word, what a fantastic interview that was. Also, coming up right after this episode airs, next week after this episode airs, we should be running the interview we did with Bob Russell. Now, Bob was the pastor of Southeast Christian Church for 40 years. That's 40. So if you're 39, he pastored the church a year longer than you've been alive, just as a data point. And Bob was fascinating, amazing. He actually did the wedding for April and me years ago. So man, what an honor to have Bob. So we've got Bob Russell coming on the show next week. We got Ken Blanchard coming on a bit later. I want to make sure we thank Eric the Man Ballard for being on at the kickoff of this series where we did the Bring Your Hammer series, as well as for helping me co-author the book. His chapters are fantastic. He wrote maybe 2/3 of the book, and they were just stellar. Way to go, Eric. Thank you so much for your contribution to the kingdom by putting your gifts of writing and humor and theology and life into the book. What I want to pivot toward, Lawson, before we close, is I want to read something from one of the guys who listens to the podcast. And as I do, I want to remind you on our podcast webpage, that's at manhoodjourney.org/podcast. That's manhoodjourney.org/podcast. There's this button. And if you press the button, it's like magic happens. And you get to leave us a voicemail. Is it a voicemail? I get whatever. You get to record.
I was calling it a voicemail too, but we've got some good ones.
Oh,
I can't wait.
Fascinating.
I'm looking forward to getting into those.
We've had a few come in just in the last month or so. We've had a few come in, and we needed to wait until we were done with the Bring Your Hammer series. We're going to slot those in, and we're going to play some of those, and almost think of it like an asynchronous call-in show where you call in, you leave a comment, question, a struggle, a complaint. Like if you don't like the way Lawson does the podcast, we get a lot of those. Just continue to call in. But if you have a question about fatherhood, you have a challenge about fatherhood, you have a good story about something you did that worked out really well, leave it for us in that voicemail. We get an email, we review them, we listen to them, and we might even play yours on a show. And then we will ridicule you mercilessly, but also at the same time, try to find some ways to encourage you or give you feedback about the question. And we've got several of those coming up. So right after the Bob Russell episode, we're going to run several of guys. So go to manhoodjourney.org/podcast right now and tell us like your greatest fatherhood challenge these days, or a fatherhood question you always wish you had the answer to. The hard ones, we just delete those and don't listen to them anymore because we don't know how to answer them. The easy softball ones, we tee up on a future episode. Meanwhile, I heard from a gentleman in my email inbox. His name is Tim Rockwell. Tim, if you're out there in lovely Dothan, Alabama, thanks for emailing us. And here's what Tim said. He said, Kent, just wanted to say that I'm really enjoying Bring Your Hammer and the Father on Purpose podcast. I also got your Manhood Journey book that I'm going to start reading next. I've been looking for solid tools to help me grow as a dad. I'm also leading a men's group of a collection of dads my age. This has been such a great resource. Thank you, and keep up the great work. Tim, way to go, man. Number one, you're actually moving the needle on our resource sales. We noticed your sales come in because the percentage was so significant. Thank you, Lawson. Secondly, thanks for being a faithful listener. Thirdly, thank you for telling us that something might have blessed you and gone well. And I don't want to overlook, I've been looking for, he says, I'm also leading a men's group of a collection of dads my age. Tim, dude, super stud, hero, way to go. So dad, if you're out there, send us an email telling us how great we are. Secondly, go to the podcast page and leave us a voicemail, even though it's probably not the right word for it. Leave a voicemail and tell us what's going on in your fatherhood world. We'll address it on a future show. Lawson, what kind of cherry should we put on the top of the Bring Your Hammer Sunday as we wrap up this 8 or 10 podcast series on the book of Nehemiah?
Bring Your Hammer Sunday. I applaud you, Tim, for leading a group of a collection of dads your age. And thanks a lot, man. I'm serious. To anybody that leaves feedback that this is helpful to them in any way, that's all we're doing this for. Is we hope that God is using this means of talking about him to help other dads. So I want to wrap this up with something that is near the end of chapter 27. It says, correction is a necessary part of being a parent. Nothing can teach you more about your father than becoming a father yourself. So about your own way of being a father, about your own father, and I would add, the relationship between you and our Heavenly Father. And so dads, encourage you to give some thought to rebuking and how you approach situations where someone in your family, maybe even sometimes your own self, you need some correction of your own. And how do you want to receive that? How do you want to receive from your Heavenly Father, where we should look forward to and appreciate and crave discipline that is coming from his love in our lives so that we can become a better father. So encourage you guys to give that some thought and continue to be a father on purpose.
Hey, Dad, thank you for listening to today's show. If you found this episode helpful, remember, you can get all the content and show notes at manhoodjourney.org/podcast. And if you really liked it, please consider doing 3 things. Number 1, share this podcast with someone. You can hit the share button in your app, wherever you listen to podcasts, or just call a person up and tell them to listen in. Number 2, subscribe to this podcast so you get episodes automatically. That helps us as well to help dads find the show. You can do that through your favorite listening app, whatever that is. And finally, review this podcast. Leave us a review, good or bad, wherever you listen. Those reviews also help other dads find the show. You can always learn more about what we're up to at manhoodjourney.org or fatheronpurpose.org. We will see you next week.
You've been dozing off to the Father on Purpose podcast featuring Kent Evans and Lawson Brown. Now, wake up. Head over to fatheronpurpose.org for more tools that can help you be a godly, intentional, and not completely horrible dad. Remember, you are not a father on accident, so go be a father on purpose.